All right, so get this. We're diving into this Champions League playoff match. But there's a French twist to this one. Brest is taking on PSG, those giants. And, you send over these articles from all these sports news sites and betting platforms. They give us, predictions and recent team performance and even some of that juicy head-to-head history. And, it might seem like a done deal, but trust me, there's more to this story than meets the eye.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head there. The contrast is pretty stark right off the bat. I mean, you've got PSG, they're a mainstay at the top of League One. They're constantly in the mix for the Champions League title. But then you have Brest. I mean, this is their first time in the tournament, so it's like a classic David versus Goliath story.
It really is. And just to kind of underline how dominant PSG has been, they haven't lost to Brest since 1985. But here's where things get really interesting. Brest didn't just squeak into the playoffs. They actually had a really strong showing in the group stage.
Yeah, they surprised a lot of people. They got some big wins against Sturm Graz and PSV. They even managed to get a draw with Bayer Leverkusen, so they clearly weren't intimidated by being on the big stage.
Okay, so they're not just happy to be there. They came to play. But didn't they hit a bit of a wall towards the end of that group stage?
Yeah, they did. Their last 3 matches were against some real heavy hitters, Barcelona, Shakhtar Donetsk, and Real Madrid. And they lost all 3. And to make matters worse, they didn't score a single goal.
So maybe those earlier wins, were they against weaker teams? I mean, does that make their success any less impressive?
Not necessarily. We got to remember, those wins weren't flukes. We have to understand why they were successful. And if you look closely, you see that Brest used this tactic. They call it a high press, which basically means they put a ton of pressure on their opponents, right in their own half, forcing errors and creating chances to score.
So they didn't just rely on individual brilliance or anything. They had a plan, a tactical plan, and it worked against those teams.
Yeah, it did. And quite well, actually. They totally messed up their opponent's build-up play, when they were trying to move the ball up the field. And that forced them into making mistakes. This aggressive approach, combined with those quick counterattacks, allowed them to really punch above their weight.
They were playing to their strengths and exploiting their opponent's weaknesses. That's smart football. But how did that same strategy do against those top teams?
That's where things get a little more tricky. See, those top teams, like your Barcelonas and Real Madrids, they're masters at handling pressure. They've got the talent to evade the press. And they're disciplined enough tactically to keep possession even when they're under pressure.
So Brest's high press, which works so well against those weaker opponents, became less effective against the elite.
Exactly. And those top teams, they punished Brest for being so aggressive. They took advantage of the spaces that Brest left open when they were pressing high. They basically turned Brest's strength into a weakness.
Makes sense. But let's not forget, PSG, despite all their dominance, they haven't been perfect lately, have they? Haven't they had some defensive issues?
Absolutely. PSG's defense has looked a bit shaky, especially in their recent matches. They've been giving up goals in most of their games, even their 5-2 win over Brest just a couple weeks ago.
Hold on, 5-2. So even when they're winning, they're letting in goals. That's something Brest could use to their advantage, right?
It's definitely a possibility if Brest can weather that initial storm from PSG and find a way to exploit those defensive gaps. They might just have a shot, but they'll need to be really sharp with their finishing, which has been a bit of a problem against those stronger teams.
It's like a high-risk, high-reward strategy. They need to be aggressive enough to score, but also careful not to leave themselves wide open at the back. It's like walking a tightrope.
Exactly right. And then, of course, there's the Ousmane Dembélé factor. He's been on fire for PSG, scoring goals left and right.
Right, Dembele. He's the one who got that hat-trick against Stuttgart. And then another 3 goals against Brest just recently, right?
Yeah, he's unstoppable right now. 20 goals in 26 games across all competitions this season. Brest's defense is going to have their hands full trying to contain him.
Okay, so we've got Brest, the underdogs, with this proven tactical approach. But they're struggling to score against those top teams. And then we've got PSG, the dominant force, with this super potent attack, but they've got a bit of a shaky defense.
It makes for a very interesting matchup. Can Brest's aggressive style disrupt PSG enough? Or will Dembele and that Parisian attack just be too much for them to handle? This might be more than just your typical David versus Goliath story.
All right, you've definitely got my attention. So where do we go from here? Should we look at how Brest might try to contain Dembele? Or maybe dive into their head-to-head history with PSG?
I think both of those are worth exploring. Let's start with Dembele's recent performance. What makes him so dangerous? What are his strengths? And are there any weaknesses that Brest could possibly exploit?
Okay, let's break down Dembele's game. and see if there are any clues that might help Brest pull off a major upset. This is where things get really interesting.
I mean, his speed and dribbling skills are just exceptional. He's a nightmare for defenders. He can cut through defenses like they're not even there, creating chaos in the final third.
So he's like a lightning bolt on the pitch. Hard to catch and even harder to stop once he gets going.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And it's not just his raw pace either. He's incredibly agile and has a ton of tricks up his sleeve. He can change direction so quickly it leaves defenders flat-footed.
Okay, so speed and agility check. What about his finishing? Is he clinical in front of goal?
He's become a lot more consistent this season. He's not just relying on power anymore. He's placing his shots with real precision. Those hat tricks against Stuttgart and Brest, they really showed his ability to find the corners of the net.
So he's the complete package. Speed, skill, and a lethal finish. Sounds like Brest will need to come up with something special to stop him.
They definitely will. Man-marking him might be an option, but that means dedicating a player just to follow him around, which could leave other areas vulnerable.
And what about a double team? Could that work?
It might. But Dembele is so good at beating his man one-on-one. Even a double team might not be enough. Brest's defenders will have to be incredibly disciplined and communicate really well if they want to limit his impact.
Okay, so no easy answers there. They'll need to be at their absolute best defensively to even stand a chance. But you mentioned earlier that Brest has a knack for scoring goals themselves.
Oh yeah, they definitely do. Their whole attacking style is based on quick transitions and exploiting those spaces behind the opponent's defense. They've been pretty prolific in League One, often outscoring their opponents.
And even against those tougher Champions League opponents, they managed to score in those victories. Do they have any specific players who could cause problems for PSG's defense?
Absolutely. They've got Ludovic Ajorc. He's their target man. He has a real handful up front, strong physical, good in the air, and he can hold up the ball and bring others into play. Plus, he's a clinical finisher. He's got 9 goals already this season.
9 goals. He's a key player for them, for sure.
Yep. He is. And then there's Abdallah Sima. He's a winger with a lot of pace and trickery. He can take on defenders, create chances for himself and his teammates. He's got 8 goals this season. Shows he can score consistently.
So even without Dembele, they've got a pretty strong attack. Do you think their style could cause problems for PSG, even with their defensive issues?
It's a bit of a double-edged sword. While Brest's attacking approach might lead to goals, it could also leave them open at the back, which would play right into PSG's hands.
That high-risk, high-reward strategy again. But maybe, just maybe, they can catch PSG on an off day and really exploit those defensive gaps.
It's not out of the question. And don't forget about the psychological side of things. Brest, despite being the underdogs, will be feeling pretty confident after their group stage performance.
And PSG might be feeling the pressure of being the favorites. Maybe that could play into Brest's hands.
It's possible. Any early setbacks for PSG, like a missed penalty or an unexpected goal from Brest, could really shift the momentum and start to make PSG doubt themselves.
So it's not just tactics and individual players, it's mental toughness too. Seizing those opportunities when they come up. This is shaping up to be a much more interesting game than I first thought.
It is. And to add another layer here,
Well,
let's look at the history between these two teams. Like we said before, PSG hasn't lost to Brest since 1985.
yeah, that was a long time ago. Those games were in a totally different era, different players, different context. Can we really learn anything from something that happened so long ago?
You're right, past results don't tell the whole story. But they can sometimes show interesting patterns or tendencies, in this case. It's worth noting that even in more recent matches, PSG has consistently dominated Brest.
So even if that 1985 stat is a bit misleading, the overall trend still favors PSG?
Yeah, that's the takeaway here.
Yeah.
Even when Brest has been competitive, they've rarely managed to actually beat PSG.
All right, so history's not exactly on Brest's side. But hey, records are made to be broken, right?
Exactly. And in football, anything can happen. We've seen upsets before,
Yeah.
and this match could be another one.
Okay, so we've talked about the tactics, the mental game, and the historical context. What else haven't we covered?
We've talked about individual players. But what about the managers? Their decisions and adjustments during the game could be really important.
Right. The manager's influence is often overlooked. What can you tell us about the 2 managers in this match?
So Brest's manager is Michel Derzakarian. He's known for his pragmatic approach. He likes a well-organized defense and quick counterattacks, kind of like what we've seen from Brest in the Champions League.
So he's the mastermind behind their high-press counterattacking style.
Exactly. And he's shown that he's willing to adapt his tactics depending on the opponent, which could be crucial in this match.
And what about PSG's manager?
Mauricio Pochettino is a top manager. lots of experience at the highest level. He prefers a possession-based style with a focus on attacking football.
So we've got a clash of styles in the dugout, too. A pragmatic tactician versus a possession-oriented maestro.
Definitely adds another layer of intrigue to this match. Will Der Zakarian's defensive organization be enough to frustrate Pochettino's attacking flair? Or will PSG's individual brilliance just overwhelm Brest?
Those are the questions that keep us football fans on the edge of our seats. It's not just about the players on the pitch, it's about the minds behind the tactics, the strategic battle that unfolds throughout the game.
And that's what makes analyzing football so interesting. It's such a complex game with so many variables, and the outcome is never certain.
I'm starting to see that. We've gone from a pretty simple matchup to this tactical and psychological chess match. It's not about who's better on paper anymore, it's about who can execute their plan better.
And who can adapt to the changes that are bound to happen during the match.
This is fascinating. So we've covered the managers, the tactics,
Yeah.
and the mental game. Anything else we need to think about before we wrap up this deep dive?
I think it's worth revisiting that idea of a Brest upset. I know the odds are against them, but we've seen a few things that could work in their favor.
Okay, let's go over those potential upset factors again. We've got Brest's aggressive style, which could disrupt PSG and take advantage of their defensive weaknesses.
Right. And then there's the psychological factor. Brest will be confident after the group stage, while PSG might feel the pressure of being the favorites.
And we can't rule out PSG having an off day, or Brest just getting lucky at a few key moments.
Those things happen in football. It's a game where the unexpected can happen, and upsets, while rare, are never impossible.
So PSG might be the favorite, but we shouldn't write off Brest completely. It's a long shot, but not impossible.
Exactly. And that's what makes this game so compelling. It's not just about the likely outcome. It's about the chance of a surprise, the possibility of David beating Goliath.
This deep dive has completely changed how I see this match. I went from thinking it was a done deal to seeing it as a real contest with all these interesting storylines.
That's the power of digging deeper. Looking at the details beyond the surface, it often gives us a richer and more complex story than we first thought.
This has been a real eye-opener. So before we wrap up, any final thoughts or predictions for this clash of styles?
I think we've covered all the important stuff. Now it's up to the players and the managers to decide what happens on the pitch.
Can't wait to see how it unfolds. It's going to be a great game. But before we go, I have one last question for you and for our listeners. Do you think Brest can pull off the upset?
That's a tough one. Logically, PSG's attack and their experience make them the favorites. But like we've been saying, Brest has shown they can really mess with the best teams using that aggressive style of theirs.
So are you saying there's a chance, even if it's a small one?
There's always a chance in football.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a game where one brilliant moment or one mistake on defense or even just a bit of luck can change the whole game.
Okay, let's play devil's advocate here for a second. If Brest were to actually pull this off, what would need to happen? What would be like the key things they'd have to do?
Well, first off, they'd have to execute that high press perfectly. They got to disrupt PSG when they're trying to build up their attack and force them into making errors. They can't give those creative PSG players, especially Dembele, any time or space with the ball.
So basically suffocate PSG's midfield, don't let them get into their passing groove, force them to rush their decisions.
Exactly. And when they get the ball back, they got to transition to attack super quickly, exploit those spaces that PSG's fullbacks leave open when they're pushing forward.
So turn PSG's attacking strength into a weakness on defense. That's a risky strategy, but if it works, it could be killer.
It could. And of course, they'll need to finish their chances. They can't waste any opportunities that come their way. Ajork and Sima got to be on point.
So tactical discipline, efficient execution, and a little luck when they're in scoring positions sounds like a lot to ask, but not totally impossible.
Yeah, it's a long shot, but that's what makes upsets so amazing. They defy the odds, and they remind us that in football, anything is possible.
This whole deep dive has been fantastic. We went from this basic analysis to really understanding the tactics and the psychology behind this matchup.
And we looked at the history, the individual players, the manager's styles, and even the possibility of an upset. It's been a pretty complete look.
It really has.
Yeah.
I feel like I'm going into this game with a whole new level of understanding of how complex football really is.
That's what's great about analysis. It helps us understand and enjoy the sport even more.
So what's the takeaway for you listening? We've given you the facts, the stats, the expert opinions. Now it's up to you to decide, do you think PSG's dominance will continue? Or is there a chance for Brest to shock everyone?
Whether you're a huge fan or just a casual viewer, this match is going to be exciting. It's a clash of styles, a battle of tactics, and a reminder that in football, you never really know what's going to happen.
Well said. And for those listening, if you want to dig deeper into those stats and predictions we talked about, all the sources we use for this deep dive are in the show notes.
Enjoy the match.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the Champions League battle between Brest and PSG. Until next time,